Framing theory is often referred to as a second level of agenda setting. And framing, as a theory of mass communication, refers to how the media packages and presents information to the public. The media highlights certain events and places them within a particular context, and it encourages or discourages certain interpretations. The media often exercises a selective influence over how people view reality, and political ads actually provide valuable lessons in framing. Back in 2012, when President Obama was running for re-election, Mitt Romney was running against him as the Republican candidate. And in one advertisement, President Obama touted his job creation record, citing over 4 million jobs that were added to the economy since he took office. In another ad, Governor Mitt Romney criticized Obama's job creation and pointed out that unemployment was still hovering around 8%, and that the economy still lacked 261,000 jobs that were lost during the president's tenure. Now, the interesting thing here is that these two advertisements rely on the same exact set of facts. The difference is that one ad frames the numbers in a positive manner, whereas the other frames them negatively. So you can see just how powerful framing can be. There are several assumptions of framing theory. The first of these is that journalists select the topics that they will present and decide how they are going to be presented to the public. This determines the issues that audiences will think about and how they are going to think about them. Next, audiences will interpret information through their own pre-existing frames. And the audience's frames may overlap with the media's frames, but they may also contradict the media's frames. In addition, frames are reinforced every time that they are evoked by the media, and this can be positive or negative. Frame building is a systematic process that occurs over time, so the frames kind of build on each other over the course of our lives. And finally, framing occurs in the media mostly because of time and resource constraints. So journalists must choose which events to cover and which ones to ignore. They must also decide what facts, values, and perspectives are going to be mentioned. And most of the time, journalists are applying their own interpretive frames on news stories when they are putting those stories together. Reporters are also influenced by social norms, pressure from interest groups, and all sorts of different ideological and political orientations that they might hold themselves. And this all affects the way that the audience takes in those messages by limiting how they perceive and interpret events. So let's talk a little bit more about framing theory. What are frames? We've been using this word frames, but what are they? So frames are systems of preconceived ideas used to organize and interpret new information. These frames function as sorts of rules of thumb that allow people to quickly process new information. And you might have heard of frames referred to previously as scripts or schemata within our heads. And these frames are mostly cultural in origin. People develop these frames from a very early age. Now, we tend to view the world through these frames. And whenever we get new information, we try to make that new information fit into the frames that we already have. And when we get information that contradicts a frame, we tend to write that information off or else distort the information so that it fits into the frame. So we try to make the new information fit into what we already know in some way, shape, or form. Journalists and politicians often try to introduce a new frame to audiences, and in order to do this, they must reference culturally popular ideas. So they have to link existing frames with the new frames that they are trying to introduce in some compelling way in order to allow the audience to accept that new frame. And what makes frames so powerful is that they are how easily they are evoked and reinforced. So if somebody already has a frame, it makes it super easy to introduce new ideas that fit into that frame. And the only way to combat a frame is to reframe the information in another, more powerful way. Now, framing has a number of really important effects. First and foremost, framing can motivate people to make riskier decisions than they otherwise would. When a problem is expressed in a negative frame, in other words, if it implies some kind of loss to the individual, people will tend to choose the riskiest option for solving the problem. Whereas when a problem is framed positively, this results in much safer decisions. So framing can have an impact on the way that we behave and the decisions that we make. In addition, framing can cause audiences to deflect responsibility for social and political problems away from our elected leaders. And this has to do with the way that a message is framed. So if a message is framed in an episodic manner, that means that the issue is treated as individual events, or rather a series of issues is treated as a series of individual events. Whereas if an issue is covered thematically, this links the events together in a case study type of format. So when audiences are exposed to more episodic news, they fail to make the logical connections between the different issues that are being covered with the elected leaders or economic realities. For example, the media is twice as likely to frame poverty episodically as opposed to thematically. And as a result of this episodic coverage, audiences tend to place the responsibility for poverty on the poor, rather than placing it on poor economic policies. So they hesitate to support government efforts to solve the problem because they don't see the logical connections between the problem and the solution. So as you can see, the way that a message is framed can have a really powerful effect on the way that that message is then interpreted by the audience.